Hi everybody, it's Nathan from Teach the Table, and today I'm teaching you how to play Twilight Imperium 3rd Edition. This is an epic board game that takes place across the entire galaxy. Each player is going to be controlling a different race, and they're going to be trying to spread out from their home system to take control of other systems containing other planets, and the ultimate goal is to prove that their race is superior to all the others in order to take control of the throne here in Mechatol Rex at the center of the galaxy. Players will compete to get 10 points, which means that they've won the game, and the points come from objective cards. Each player has one secret objective card, as well as a number of public cards which will come out throughout the game, which a player will have a chance to claim if they meet the criteria. On each player's race sheet, it shows you all the various steps of the game, as well as all the various units that you have at your disposal that you can build, so the cost to build them, how they battle, as well as how they move. Up at the top is your special abilities, so these are abilities that your race has that no one else has, as well as in this area here. Now these are where we put what's called our command counters, and those are going to have to be used very wisely because those are the main things that let you do anything in the game. Your general supply of pieces that aren't in use are called your reinforcements, and if you ever get an opportunity to get new command counters from your reinforcements, you're going to get to choose which of these 3 sections you want to place them in. Placing them in these 2 outside spots gives you more actions that you can do during the game, as well as placing them in the inside here. You do it upside down to indicate it goes into your fleet supply, so that tells you the maximum number of large ships that you can have in each system on the board. Each player will have starting technologies that will bend the rules for them a little bit, as well as cards for each planet that they control, so starting out you just have the planets in your home system. Planets will give you resources as well as political influence indicated on the cards there. Each player also has 2 trade agreements, so if they want to form a trade agreement with another player, they used to exchange one of their cards with another player's, and those are going to yield you trade goods in the future. You can never give both of your trade agreements to the same player, so you have to have agreements with 1 or 2 other people or none at all. As indicated on your race sheet, the game takes place over a number of rounds, starting with the strategy phase, where people will choose 1 or 2 of these strategy cards depending on the number of players. Then there's the action phase, also known as the do stuff phase, where everything gets done out on the board. Then we have a status phase, which will include claiming objectives to get points, and then a general cleanup and refreshing before we start over. For the strategy phase, players are simply going to choose some of these strategies to put in front of themselves. In a 5 to 6 player game, players are just going to have 1 strategy. In a 3 and 4 player games, players will have 2. The strategy cards have abilities on them, which won't happen until the action phase, but they also have these numbers, and those indicate the turn order for the action phase. So choosing the lowest number will automatically let you go first. Choosing the highest number will automatically make you go last, with various people in between. Strategy cards are chosen 1 at a time, starting with the speaker and going in a clockwise manner around the table. So if you're going to be choosing 2 of them, everyone will choose 1, and then the speaker will choose 1 again, and it will continue. Any strategy cards that weren't chosen in that round will get a bonus marker, so that during the next round, if someone chooses it, they'll get that bonus, which they can trade in for either a trade good or another command counter to place on their board. Since my example game here is a 4-player game, each player is going to choose 2 of these, so there won't be any left over for bonus counters. When you have 2 strategy cards, the turn order is determined by the lowest number out of your 2. So in this case, this person will go first, second, third, and fourth because of the lowest number that they have. That's it for the strategy phase, so next is the action phase. There's a number of actions you can do, and they start with the player who has the lowest strategy card that they chose. So they're going to get to choose 1 available action, perform that, then it goes to the next player in turn order, etc., and just keeps going around and around. When it comes to your turn, you can choose 1 of 4 available actions. The strategic action relates to the strategy cards that you chose in the last phase. At some point during this action phase, it's required that you do use the strategy cards that you chose. To do so, you'll get to do the primary ability on the strategy card that you choose, and other players are going to get an option to do the secondary ability going in a clockwise manner around the table. To do so, they're going to have to spend a command counter from their strategy allocation section. So that's what the strategy allocation is for. Caveat to that rule is the logistics strategy, and because logistics relates to you spending influence from your planets to get more command counters onto your board, you do not have to spend a command counter from strategy allocation in order to do that second ability. But all the other second abilities, you would have to spend one here in order to do what it says on there. After performing your strategic action, you can flip this over to prove that you've used it, because it is required that you use your strategy cards before you're able to pass. If you choose to pass, you're done on this action phase. You can't do anything else. Unless players choose to play their strategy cards, you still will have the opportunity to do the second ability on those. The majority of actions you do are going to be tactical actions, and that's where you use the command counters from your command pool in order to do something. Tactical actions take place over a sequence of steps. However, some of those steps may get ignored if they don't apply to this situation. For instance, if you don't have some of your ships in the same system as some enemy ships, there's not going to be a space battle. But it always starts with activating a system, which means you're going to take one command counter from your command pool and put it on a system. So let's go to the board. First step of a tactical action is activating the system. So you take a command counter from your command pool and place it in the system you want to activate. You can never activate a system that already has one of your command counters in there. So let's take a look at the units available to you, starting with the space dock. Space docks are used to build your other units. So you put it on a planet, and then you can build either planetary units on there, or you can build other space units into space. The Planetary Defense System, or a PDS, is a force that you build onto a planet, and it basically makes a shield around the planet as well as has a gun attached that it's able to shoot during battles. There's also ground forces represented by this little flag here, and those are what you put on planets to take control of planets. Then we have the space units, starting with the fighter, which is a little tiny puny ship. It doesn't do great in battles by itself, and it also can't fly outside of a system, so it has to be carried. That brings us to the carrier. So its primary function is to carry your other forces. So it can carry fighters, ground forces, and your PDS in any combination with a capacity of 6, so up to 6 units. Next we have the destroyer, which is fairly weak in combat on its own, but it does have a special ability called Anti-Fighter Barrage. So before combat starts, each destroyer gets to roll a couple dice and potentially can take out some fighters before combat even begins. Next we have the cruiser, which is the larger cousin of the destroyer. It doesn't have that special ability of the destroyer, but it does do better in combat on its own. The last ship that's available from the beginning of the game is the Dreadnought, which is a very powerful ship. It also has a special ability called Planetary Bombardment. So if you put your ground forces down onto a planet where someone else's ground forces are, then a Dreadnought in that same system gets a first chance of destroying the opposing ground forces before any planetary combat happens. The last unit here is the War Sun, which is the most powerful unit in the game. It does require special technology for you to build before you're able to build a War Sun. And like the Dreadnought, it can do planetary bombardment, and like the carrier, it has capacity 6, so it can carry your fighters, ground forces, and PDS units as well. The War Sun and the Dreadnought can also take 2 damage instead of 1 that all the other units can take. So if they get hit, you put them on their side to signify that they've taken 1 damage. If they were to take another damage, then they'd be removed from the board. I also mentioned that the PDS makes a planetary shield, and that will protect against bombardment from the Dreadnought, but not from the War Sun. So if a Dreadnought's trying to bombard a planet and it has a PDS, that bombardment can't happen. I mentioned that the command counters on your fleet supply area of your race sheet indicate the maximum number of ships you can have in each system. So that counts for all of these ships, not fighters. Fighters don't count against that. However, a fighter does always have to have capacity wherever it's at, even if it's outside of a ship. So in this case, the carrier has 6 capacity, and it would be fine to carry those 4 fighters. Even if the fighters are flying around, you have to prove that you have capacity for them. A space dock has a capacity of 3 for fighters. So if this carrier was able to move away, then it would have to take at least one of these fighters with it, because the capacity is only 3 on that space dock. Otherwise, that fighter that didn't get carried would just wither away and die. The next step is movement into the system. So you look at the movement speed of the ships on your race sheet. They all have a movement of at least 1, so they could all move into this adjacent system like so. If you wanted to, since this carrier has capacity of 6, you could pick up as many of these ground forces as you wanted and move them with you. You would just put a control marker on these planets to signify that you still control those planets. When you activate a system in order to move ships, you have to keep in mind the movement value of the ships you're trying to move. So any ships that can reach this spot, you can move there, but you can't move ships partially. So these 2 units only have a movement of 1, which would only get them to there. So they wouldn't be able to move, part of the way and then stop there. You can only move ships that would be able to get all the way into that area. During your movement, ships that are in systems that are already activated cannot move. But if you wanted to move through a system that was activated, you could do that. You can also move through a system that has enemy units as long as there are only ground forces or fighters. But if there's any ships larger than fighters, you would have to stop your movement in that space because you're going to have a space combat. Next step is PDS fire. So if an enemy had any PDS within range of your fleet there, they could try to fire at you once. And then if you had any PDS in range of any enemy fleets, you could fire yours after that as well. Next would be a space battle. So if there's enemy ships at that same location, you would have a battle and resolve that. Next we have planetary landing. So any of these ground forces on the carrier, you could choose and land them on either of these planets. Next we have invasion combat, which is basically a planet battle. So if there were enemy forces on one of those planets, you would have a planet battle. Since I've now taken over those 2 planets, you look into the planet deck, take out the cards corresponding to those 2 planets, and you're going to get them in your supply. They will go face down to show that they're exhausted right now, but during the status phase, they will go back face up so I can use them on the next turn. Last step of a tactical action is production. So if I had a space dock here, I could produce more units by paying the cost associated with them. But again, we're only working on this system that I just activated. So I couldn't go and produce things at this space dock because that's not the activated system. When producing units at a space dock, you can produce 2 units plus the number of resources there. So in this case, you could build 4 units in that space dock. And that's just 4 of any unit, regardless of what they are. So fighters, ground forces, large ships, all count as 1 in this case. During production, you can also produce a new space dock on one of the planets in that system that you've activated. The rules for that are that there can be no enemy units in there whatsoever, and it can't be a planet that you just gained during this round. So you have to have had the planet at least for 1 round before this, and there could be no other space docks on that planet since there can only be 1 on each planet. So if you meet all those criteria, you can build a new space dock like so by paying the cost. One thing to keep in mind is that ships that are in an activated system cannot leave. So on my next turn, if I wanted to activate this system to move ships over there, I could not do that because all of these ships are stuck. Next, I'll show you how combat works. So combat is resolved using 10-sided dice. If you roll a 0, that is a 10, so you're always going to roll either a 1 through 10. Before combat starts, we have the potential for destroyer anti-fighter barrage. So I have a destroyer and they have fighters, so that means we can do it. 2 dice are going to get rolled, and we're going to compare that to the combat value of the destroyer, which is 9. So for each 9 or 10, I get to take out 1 fighter. So I got a 10 here, 1 fighter is destroyed before combat begins. First step of combat is announcing withdrawals and retreats. So if the attacker, let's say that's me, decides he wants to withdraw, he can announce that. If he doesn't, then the defender can announce that they'd like to retreat. In order to withdraw or retreat, the player must have an adjacent system that is activated by them in a previous round. So in this case, I could withdraw over here, but it's not executed until the end of this round of combat. The next step is rolling the combat dice, and this happens simultaneously between both sides. So the best way to do it is roll all the dice you need, calculate how many hits are made, and then take out the units. Each ship gets to roll 1 dice, and you compare that to the battle value. So my destroyer needs a 9 or higher, that's a miss. My carrier needs a 9 or higher, that's a miss. And my dreadnought needs a 5 or higher, so that's 1 hit. Then we do yellow. So the yellow destroyer needs a 9 or higher, that's a miss. Carrier needs a 9 or higher, that's a miss. Cruiser needs a 7 or higher, that's a 10, so that would be 1 hit. And then each of the fighters needs a 9 or higher, so that's 1 additional hit. So 2 hits for yellow, 1 hit for red. Players get to choose how they'd like to take their own damage, so the red player may just take 1 hit on his dreadnought and lose his destroyer, and the yellow player might just lose 1 of their fighters. Then it's just going to continue again. If I had announced that I wanted to withdraw, this would be the time to do it. I could withdraw right there. If I hadn't announced it, then it's just going to continue, starting with announcing withdrawal again. This will just continue until 1 player has either withdrawn or retreated, or until only 1 player remains in that area. Invasion combat on a planet happens similarly to the space combat. So the first thing is the dreadnoughts have that planetary bombardment ability. So they get to roll 1 die, and on a 5 or higher, they can take out one of those ground forces from the very beginning. If there was a PDS on that planet, they could not do the planetary bombardment because the PDS has a planetary shield that would protect that. The next step on there is PDS fire. So if there's a PDS on that planet, they can roll 1 die, and on a 6 or higher, they could take out the enemy invading ground forces. Next is the rolling combat dice. So each side simultaneously gets to roll their dice. Any 8 or higher is a hit. So yellow is a hit there, etc. And you just keep going. Combat continues until there's only 1 force left standing. If both of yellow's ground forces had been taken out, this would be a successful invasion, and they would lose their PDS, and red would get that planet card. So that's how tactical action works. The last of the possible actions you can do is a transfer action, which you won't do as often. It works similar to a tactical action. However, you're going to be trying to transfer units between two adjacent systems. You can only do it if neither system has already been activated and if there's no enemy units of any kind in those systems. And since you're going to be using two systems here, one command counter comes from your command pool and one just comes from your resources. So you only use one command counter from your command pool to do this. And then once you've activated those two systems, you can freely transfer units back and forth in any capacity, keeping in mind that you don't want to go above your fleet capacity. Then if you like, you can go through the same steps as all the tactical actions. So any PDS in range will get to fire on you if they can. And then you can do planetary landings. So you can only land units on planets that you already have. So if it's a neutral planet where no one has control of it, or if an enemy has control of it, you cannot do that. So this is only going to be something you do just to transfer units when you've already got control of both systems effectively. Once all the players have done all the actions that they want, they can pass as long as they've done both of their strategic actions that they have to. And then once every player has passed, we're going to start the status phase. First part of the status phase is qualifying for objectives. So you can qualify for one public objective during this phase as long as you qualify for it. If you've already got that objective, you cannot get it again. So you just claim it, prove that you've got whatever it says, and then you get victory points associated with that. You can also qualify for your secret objective at the same time. So a maximum of two, one public and your secret objective. If you ever show your secret objective and you don't qualify for it, it's going to go back to the box and you lose it. So make sure that you don't show this and try to qualify for it until you actually do. Objectives are claimed in turn order, so there is advantage to going first if everyone's getting close to winning the game. Players can never qualify for a public or a secret objective if they don't control all the planets in their home system, however. Next, you simply repair any damaged ships that you've got, so if they're flipped on their side, you can flip them back face up. Next, you're simply going to take back your command counters from the board, refresh any planets that you've exhausted. Each player is going to receive one action card. You have a hand limit of 7 of these, so if you've already got 7, you're going to have to discard 1. As well as 2 command counters that they get to put on their race sheet. Then you can rearrange all your command counters on your race sheet to meet whatever criteria you're planning for the next round. Then all the strategy cards that people chose in the last round are going to go back to the middle of the table so everyone can choose again at the beginning of the next. That's 90% of the game. Most other stuff I haven't mentioned comes from the strategy cards, which I'll just let you read before your first game, but there are a few things I want to point out. There is a political strategy which allows you to get a political card. Some of them say laws on them, which that's something's going to happen and that's going to stay out in effect for the rest of the game unless something changes that. And some of them are just one-time things that happen. If there's an election involved, you're going to use the influence from all of your non-exhausted planet cards. The influence is on the right-hand side here, and you don't have to exhaust them to use the influence. You're just going to add up however much you have. You can also supplement your trade goods to count as any resource or any influence in the game, or you can use them to barter with other people to try to bribe them into doing something your way. Each player has an identical technology deck of all the available technologies that they can build, and they're broken down into different types based on different colors. You will have to pay a number of resources in order to build them usually, and most of them have prerequisites on the card of what you have to have first. The rulebook has this technology tree which shows all the prerequisites and what they would lead to. It's kind of hard to read, so I would recommend just printing something off online. Maybe each player can have one in front or pass it around. Just something that's a little easier to read. Some planets will have an icon to show that they specialize in certain technologies, and that's also located when you take the planet card down on the bottom there. What that indicates is then when you want to buy a technology of that certain color, you can buy it for 1 resource less. You still have to meet the prerequisites, it just costs you 1 less for each planet that you have that's not exhausted that has that specialty. I mentioned the trade agreements you can have with other players, and if you exchange with other players, you get a number of trade goods during this trade strategy. One thing that will break that agreement though is if there's ever open conflict. So if there's ever a space battle or an invasion combat between you and the person you have that agreement with, it will automatically nullify this agreement. So just give the cards back to each other. The action cards in your hand have kind of a funny rule about how you can play them too. Some of them say play as an action, so that's just something you're going to play instead of an action on your turn. But other cards will say certain times of the game in which you can play them. If you want to play a card, you have to announce to the table that you intend on playing an action card, and that gives everyone around the table an option to announce that they intend on doing it at the same time. That's going to get resolved in turn order based on the strategy cards. If no one has strategy cards at this point, it's going to go around the table, starting with the person with the speaker token, just clockwise. So people who wanted to play an action card during that moment all get to do that in that order. The only thing that does not match up to that is the sabotage, because you're going to play that immediately after another player plays an action card. So that's something that you don't have to announce. You're just going to play that when someone else plays a card. Some of the systems in the galaxy have special movement rules, starting with the wormholes. So the ones that are both marked with the B, those are considered to be adjacent to each other because you can travel through the wormhole to the other side, and vice versa. The A and A work the same way. The supernova is something that you can't move through at all. It just completely blocks your path. The asteroid field is something that you can move through. You can never end your movement inside of it, but if you get a certain technology, that gives you the option to move through it. Otherwise, without that technology, you have to go around it. The nebula works like the opposite of the asteroid field. You can never move through it. You always have to end your movement in there. If you decide to move on a different round, your movement's going to be reduced to 1 to get out. So it kind of slows down your movement that way. If you're in the nebula and another player comes and there's a space battle in there, then you're the defender, so you get a +1 to your combat rolls since you're defending inside the nebula. All the ships and tokens in the game are considered to be limited, so if you ever need more and you run out, then there's no more available to you. The exception to that is these tokens for extra fighters and for ground forces. So if you need extra of either of those, you're just going to place one of your ground forces with the token or however many tokens you want underneath to signify that you've got multiples of those. So those two things are considered to be unlimited. That's how you play Twilight Imperium 3rd edition. First player to get to 10 points is going to be the winner, or if someone can claim an objective that says they win the game, or whenever the Imperium Rex comes out, that means the game is over, so whoever has the most points at that point is going to be the winner. The 4th edition is just now coming out, so there's probably lots of secondhand copies of the 3rd edition out there, so hopefully this is a helpful run through on how to get it to the table. Thanks for watching Teach the Table. I'll see you next time, and don't forget to have fun.